have a meeting with him at the airport at 4 to pick up his coils.
Oh, awesome.
And the 2 coils that we got off the that Wally pulled off of our spares, those are still down there. They haven't been tested as of yesterday. So,
Oh, good to know. I didn't know that.
yeah, I just got that report from Steve late yesterday. So,
Oh, good. I didn't see that.
yeah, and I think when you do text messages, it's harder to copy people.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, but yeah, he said that because I just told him I was getting those 2 from Chris, and I was asking him, do I still need to get them? If we have a good coil, we don't need to borrow his.
Right.
So, but Chris wants me to draft up some type of a written borrowing agreement. So I'm going to draft up something and I'll send it to you and stand okay. But I've got to give him something when I pick him up today. So I'll be working on that today, this morning, maybe while the meeting's going on here. So, but,
cool. By the way, I went with Steve and we went through his instructor pilot stuff yesterday, and got all his credentials and the forms filled out online and stuff. And I submitted that last night. So.
Oh, good. Yeah.
That was yesterday's project.
Yeah, it's all a lot of details.
Yeah.
I'll let you work on that. I'm going to sign off here. I'll see you at 10:30.
Sounds good.
Moving like this, make sure nothing is loose. I'll check all of that. Usually the elevator, make sure that works, and then you see some heating. This side is the rubber. So this piece that we're on the year ago, the whole year, that's what it is. The ball is 14 minutes for the whole year. And that's the biggest problem. Then I'll check the water, and sometimes the water. I'll check make sure all of the holes are in, and the sound I'll give it to the little again. And use this and put it with the play. Make sure that the have cable off. Well, I've already checked for the air pressure, 50 feet of time, and you don't do that first. I'm next, check all the things here. This is a wheel. Look at the airplane, and then where they go on. Yeah. Okay. I can a little more scripted, so I kind of like it. I don't know. You know, we can knock it out in 10 minutes. You can look at more beyond that. Right.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah, that'll work out good.
Cheering.
Hey fellas, Paul's here.
Hey, Paul.
Good morning.
We have to turn off. Good. Hi there.
So, we've got a remote camera. Stan's got a headset. Cool. I'm just gonna follow him with the computer.
Oh, that's awesome.
I'll probably maybe start out holding the camera, see how it goes. So you can show people what we're looking at. So I'm not counting on a Pulitzer. I hope we can get one, but yeah.
Good. I've seen people do stuff with their phones, but the problem with the phone is you can't see. There's a very limit in what you can see. So like the chat,
field of view?
yeah, the chat.
Oh,
All
right.
of that just becomes a lot more difficult. Plus, if you're trying to show something, now you're moving your phone away and then you can't hear
Oh, correct.
it's off. Yep, yeah, thanks. That's why I thought using the computer would probably work the best. Try and give a good experience to people.
Right.
Only three of these guys related to the final. One going to be unmasked.
I worked so hard and been through so much. I won't be chunky more than I've ever wanted anything in my life. Anyone can take it.
The best is extreme. Walk to the mask. Wednesday on Fox. I told you I don't remember much about being attacked. It was behind me, and then all of a sudden, it tased. The next clear memory I have is being in the back of the ambulance and the look on my husband's face. I thought I was dying because he thought I was, but you didn't. You survived. But I should. He had me dead to rights. Came up behind me. I didn't even know he was there. I've been a police officer for 30 years. I love my job and I'm good at what I do because I've always been able to trust my gut. But now, you're doubting yourself. I should have called you back up before I went inside. But I scared the hell out of my family and myself. And now I'm left feeling like I can't trust my instinct anymore. How the hell am I supposed to go back out there feeling like this? You're not going back out there tomorrow.
Hey, Henning.
Yo.
Could we take a look at your desktop for a second? And could you flip to my last slide?
I can. Hang in. Let me know when you have it popped up there.
I see it. Yeah, slide 12. Oh boy, it's all mixed up. Oh no. What are you using? Are you using Keynote?
No, I'm using Microsoft PowerPoint.
Oh wow. Oh no.
When you say mixed up, what?
Oh, the graphics are all squished and out of place and shoot.
Oh, there is stuff down here on the side, isn't there? Huh?
Yeah. Could you go into presentation mode on this one,
I can.
please? Yep. And then hit the space bar. There it goes. Okay, well, it works, but it's a mess. Oh no. How would you feel about running off of my slides?
I'm fine with that. Here, do you want to give it a try?
Yeah, could we please?
All right, hang on. Stop your sharing. Your ball game.
Yet another collaboration tool. How do I share my screen?
There's when you put your mouse in the Zoom window, you'll see a little green button that says share screen.
Okay, that's pretty obvious. Thank you. All right, so how does this look?
That looks fine. I can see the little blue dots and the green. That looks awesome. I can actually read
Yeah.
all the different stuff that happened at given times.
Okay, so I'm gonna go, you see the full width?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, that I see what you mean. It does look much better.
Okay. Super. Okay, so I'm gonna give this back to you.
Okay.
If I can figure out how.
It's the stop share.
Oh my gosh. Meeting controls.
Hello.
Stop share. Found it.
How y'all doing?
Good morning,
Steve.
Steve.
Good. There we go. I've got a front row seat to the action out here in the hangar.
Uh-oh. Good.
Morning, guys.
Hi.
Good morning.
Its RV is a complete one field, once a day treatment.
Steve, what's the latest on the Moth?
It's not
I think we're just a couple weeks away from getting the engine finished.
That's good.
And Henning, you'll like that I tried to fly the Chipmunk with Vic yesterday.
research shows.
Oh, you did?
And
Awesome.
his comment was, "Well, you certainly like to see all sides of the runway."
Oh, no.
Man, I was really having trouble keeping it straight. I'll tell you that.
Because of touchiness on the controls?
Yeah, I think I have bozo feet, and what you need is little ballerina feet. You know.
This is true.
Yeah.
But we'll cut you a lot of slack there, my friend, because
Yes.
you haven't flown in a while and you're
Yeah.
used to big, heavy things. So
Yeah, right. Right. All that heavy iron, those tiger moths and stuff. Yeah. Anyway, it was fun.
Oh, that's awesome.
But I give you credit. That's a very sensitive little airplane to.
Introducing
Hi, Jeanette.
easy self setup.
Yeah, thanks. Well, you have to get you some more time in it to get you that feel.
Well, he saw his light flash before his eyes twice. So if you're
Oh
up for
no.
that, if you're up for that,
Were you flying front seat or rear seat?
back, rear.
Yep.
Yeah.
We're doing everything we can to get you what you need.
No.
Doing everything
That
we
was
can
fun.
to keep our people safe.
I flew a Cub from the back seat, and I'll agree, Steve. I found it a lot more difficult.
Yeah.
Motorcycle riders love the open road. Geico loves helping riders get to where they're going.
Okay.
Does it help even more?
I'll have you know that Stan's being sort of a diva. He wants green M&Ms and avian water in his dressing room.
Yep.
Yeah.
And because we're committed,
And he wants to know if he's got a good side. Does he have a good side?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Left.
I said you're sitting on it.
He's got a backside. Yeah.
Right, right.
I heard you are to cut the ambassador's head off and fill it with meatballs.
This is supposed to be a fun surprise.
Yeah. All right, guys, I'll be right back. I'm gonna.
Thursday night on Fox. Go to Leslie Holmes and watch TV right alongside them.
We're watching everything you're watching, but we got a lot to say about it.
Last week's musical shock, fun, and close moments, and we'll still recover. I'm not looking, but I might be.
Okay, guys, 2 minutes till showtime. Hey, Steve, just an audio check. Do you hear me okay?
Yes, 5x5 heading, all good.
All right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
Sound good, sir.
7,
Mhm.
8.
Hi, Steve. Hi, Gary.
Hey, hey. Good morning.
All right.
All right, who has their best Good Morning Vietnam presentation here?
Good morning, Vietnam.
There you go.
Good morning, Henning Henningsen.
All right. All
Anybody
right.
hear me now?
I can hear you.
Okay,
I hear
good.
you fine.
I can hear you. I'm in the other room.
Oh, can I get your notes, the housekeeping notes? Yeah, I can. Give it about 2 more minutes for people to log on.
All right.
It's my autopilot.
Yeah.
I'm serious, and don't call me Shirley. Otto is my co-pilot. That's my coffee mug. I got that at the auction at one of our banquets.
Ah, I think there's some history in that.
Yeah.
All right, why don't we get started?
Give us 1 second.
Okay.
Call out to a little thanks to Leah Block, and go ahead, Leah. All right. Just to let everybody know, Leah Block has been very nice to let us borrow the CAF Zoom meeting for our meeting today, and she's going to record it for us. So over to you, Stan.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate everybody attending. A couple housekeeping items first. We're going to be recording this, just so you know. So whatever smart aleck comments you make, Henning, they'll be recorded forever. Please mute yourself if you're not talking. That just makes it a little bit easier for everybody else to hear. And ask questions in the chat feature. That might be easiest when we do, especially when we do the walk around the PT. And please use speaker mode. So whoever is speaking, their picture will come up larger. And so when we're doing the walk around, that's going to be much better than just having a really tiny screen. And that'll maximize the view of whoever is talking. And just remain muted. Ready? Okay, why don't we start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Let's move that up. All right. We were going to open the hangar door, but we have some pretty hefty winds, and we didn't need the flag flying that fast. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. All right. So thank you, everybody, for attending this. You know, it's been unfortunate that with the Wisconsin shutdown and people, of course, wanting to social distance, that we haven't been able to meet together. And even though Wisconsin is open right now, out of respect to people who did want to social distance, we thought we would do this remotely this time, and I think it's going to be fun. I wanted to mention a couple things, and if everybody is on Facebook, this morning, Roberta put on our Facebook page a great video produced by Bob Weigert with input film from a lot of different people on the victory over Europe flyover last Friday. 5 pilots, Vic Stoudemire, Stan Marcus, Tim Gillian, Carl Schwerman, and Paul Walter did a 5-ship flyover over the VA Hospital Milwaukee, over the War Memorial during their celebration, and as well as did a flyover at Mitchell Field, which I think was really appreciated by the controllers. So check that out. It's a wonderful video, and it really does our unit proud. And thank you so much to all the pilots for contributing their time and treasure to do this flyover in celebration of such a big day from VE Day.
Hey Stan, can
yes.
we get that? Is there any chance we can get that posted on the CAF Wisconsin website? I'm not a fan of Facebook, so I've avoided it.
Sure, we can talk to Roberta. I'm sure she can get that posted on there. So thanks, Steve. So I'm going to turn this over to Paul Holdridge, who's going to talk about the history of the PT. And that will then we will follow with Henning with some information about the aircraft from our ground schools, and then we will go through a live pre-flight walk around of the PT at the end of the meeting.
All right. And over to you, Paul.
Okay.
Do it.
So can you all see my screen?
It's on its way. There we go.
All right, super. So good morning. I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about the history of 9474 Hotel, our 1943 PT-26. Going to talk a little bit about where it came from and where it's gone. And then Henning will talk through the background, as Stan said. There it goes. All right, so our PT 26 was built by Fleet Aircraft up in Fort Erie, which is across the river from Buffalo, New York. It was built in November of 43, and it was assigned to, as a primary trainer, it was assigned to one of the training divisions up in Calgary, where it served for a little over a year, and then was marked for sale or sold for disposal in September of 45. In the US, the designation was the PT-26, or primary trainer. Canada was referred to as the Cornell 2. A couple of unique features I'm sure Henning will talk about and Stan will talk about later. As you see in the picture, I just wanted to point out, you see the canopy is open here. And you also see the unusual flap type that is on this airplane. And you can also see some of the interior construction here, which, as I said, Henning will talk about later, but it's a good picture here of the split flaps. And Stan will certainly talk about why the canopy is open. So a little bit about Fleet Aircraft, who built the airplane. It was founded in 1928 by Mr. Fleet. He had purchased rights from Consolidated to produce some other primary trainer types. And then only about a year later, they went ahead and merged with Consolidated in 1929 and became known as Fleet Aircraft of Canada. They developed a number of primary trainers, and pictured here on the left is two of their Model 2 trainers that they went on to develop well through the 40s. The PT-26 was produced under the Lend-Lease Act during the early 40s. They made quite a number of different aircraft, including the Fleet Finch, the Canuck, and others for the RCAF. They finally did end operations in 1957, and many of their records were destroyed in a fire, as I understand, under suspicious circumstances late in the 50s. So many of the original records that we would have liked to have are really completely lost to history. They were, however, restarted in 2003 and are currently operating. And I've certainly exchanged email with them, and they're very proud of their history, their involvement and support of the war effort. And as far as I understand, they're making helicopter parts for the RCAF still today. Just as a quick note, on the bottom left, you see a really good picture of the Model 2 trainer from Fleet, and that's running a Kinner engine. And there is another example of that in Smithsonian in Washington, if you're interested to see it. And please stop me if you have any questions or comments. As I mentioned, they built the PT-26 under the Lend-Lease Act from the US Army. It began being built around 1942 and went to the end of 43. This picture here is the Fort Erie plant in January of 1944, which was just about 6 weeks after our PT would have left the factory. And in fact, on the field, you can see about 50 Cornells parked and ready for delivery in a single strip paved runway. This factory is still there and is still operating.
Wow.
So our serial number is 10871. It was one of the last groups of orders, and one of the largest last group of 157 aircraft built in late 43. It was split deliveries between the RCAF, the Canadian Air Force, and the Royal Norwegian Air Force. And so it was completed in early November and then shipped and flew out to Calgary over Thanksgiving and stopped through Madison on its way up to Calgary. As I mentioned, it was delivered to a flying school in Calgary. The group on the left is Course 88, who graduated on December 10th from that school. Now, these guys would have graduated just a week or so after our PT was delivered, but you can certainly see the age and the type of group of guys that would have been training and flying in this airplane as their first flight experience. Most of them were training for the Avro Anson or Avro Lancaster bombing applications. And on the right is a aerial picture of a flying school. This one is over in Manitoba, but very similar, a large base, a large primary flight training school from the period. A number of different paint schemes. Most of them were either painted yellow, like the bottom left, or a gray or light blue color, depending on the deployment. The bottom left is an interesting picture. This serial number is 10835. That was a special Cornell because it was the 1000th Cornell built and is in a museum today. And it's only just a few serial numbers before ours, 40 or so serial numbers before ours was built. So very close to what ours would have been. And you can see 9474 Hotel up in the upper left, painted in US Army Air Corps colors, because some of these did serve in the Army Air Forces, and when ours was recovered, it was painted in that scheme to honor the American servicemen that would have trained in it. They did train through the winter in an airplane that really has no heat. They were converted for skis, as you can see on the left. Obviously in Canada, that would make a lot of sense. And as I mentioned, they were trained for the bombing applications. And you can see the size of a Lancaster on the right. Plane Talk was the company newsletter of fleet aircraft. This one from April of '44 with a PT-26 positioned next to a Lancaster. As I mentioned, ours was retired from service in '45 and then finally sold for $1,000 to Mr. Elroy Lewis. And here you have the original bill of sale from 15th November 1946. He purchased it in Florida and flew it up to Maryland and held it for about a year. And then the PT changed hands quite a number of times. Everything on blue on the bottom is sales of the airplane. So all through the 50s, it changed hands 8 times. And then Mr. Don Shaver in Missouri got a hold of it, and he really held that airplane for about 40 years. He recovered it several times, did a complete overhaul, quite a lot of work, and really took good care of the airplane. It appears it was in storage for quite a long time, perhaps 10 or 20 years, and then finally sold to Joel Chase in Livermore, where it changed hands a couple more times before landing with the Air Power Heritage Flying Museum, which is also known as the CAF. And it's been taken care of. This is why it's a good example. You can see all throughout history, it continually was improved, recovered, engines replaced and maintained. And that's what's given us the luxury of having a great example of a PT-26. So any questions on any of that?
Looks like it's had quite the history in the green up on top there too. It's good. It's really good stuff to see and know about our airplane.
Yeah, it is. That's one of the great examples, I think, of this, and or what makes this airplane a great example is that it has been maintained continuously. You know, I said it was in storage for an unknown period of time, but throughout its history, it has continually been maintained and updated. So we're very fortunate for that.
Considering it was a trainer, when you look at 1955 with 634 hours of total time on it, that's after the Canadians were done training in it. So that's actually pretty good.
Yeah, that's part of that is certainly due to the fact that it was delivered in December of '43 and really only saw active service for a little over a year, and some of that time in storage. So yep. From what I can tell, it certainly appears that it very likely did some primary training, but fortunately was not under a lot of heavy use.
Sure. Awesome, Paul.
Okay. So I'll give it back to you, Henning.
All right. You know if you're seeing my desktop here.
Yep.
All right, we'll talk a little bit about the PT-26 from our ground school, and I'll give you a little bit more details on the airframe and various other pieces. Then we're going to do a walk around with Stan. So, the PT-26 Cornell went off and was very typical of many of our World War II trainers. That was built out of a combination of wood and steel tubing, um, and basically fabric covered of the time. That center construction that you see on the right side there with that main piece, um, is this main spar with the kind of a combination of all glued together. Um, the structure itself is made out of spruce and mahogany plywood. It has laminated spars. It's steel reinforced ribs on there. And originally it was cloth that covered this, but in more modern times, the airplane has since been covered in something what we call seconite, which is that drum-like material that you'll have on all the control surfaces and anything fabric these days. So what those steel tubes look like on the inside, this is a picture with inside one of the cockpits. You can see the stick there on the left side of the picture. So this is kind of a typical chromoly-based steel, but it actually, because of corrosion issues and stuff, they actually poured linseed oil through the tubing in order to keep corrosion down. And the metal's it's basically made out of aluminum, very typical for the day. It makes it for a very light construction on the airplane, but realize as far as World War II trainers, this airplane's 2,800 pounds, which is fairly heavy. When you compare it to your typical Citabria or something like that coming in between 1,500 pounds, this is 1,300 pounds heavier. So, the wooden wings and things like that do add quite a bit of structure and some weight to it. And it was kind of built like that on purpose because you wanted it to give you that initial introduction into the World War II type trainers, but you want it to be a little bit heavy because your next step was probably to go to the BT-13 or even possibly the T6, or in the case of the Canadians here, the Harvard, which was the Canadian version of the T6. Stepping in here for a moment, just as we do a little bit of our walk around from our pilot school, obviously we talk about pay a good attention to our landing gear and stuff like that. And again, very similar to the times, but it's a fixed gear airplane, so the gear does not retract. But there's a spring oleo strut inside these tubes in here, and there's brake fluid in there, and the hydraulic brake fluid that's in is really compressed, and they call it 5606 red. But if you see it laying on the ground next to the wheel, obviously talk to your pilot about it. But what it really is it looks like it's a kind of a clear honey type color. So, and very typical for World War II gear, the main gears, 35 pounds that we weigh it in at. The gear itself for the main is actually fairly wide and made the PT-26 to be somewhat forgiving and have very good training characteristics for the PT, for the World War II trainer types. There were obviously Stearmans were another typical World War II trainer that had a little bit narrower gear. Plus, when you combine that in with it being a little more top heavy, with being a biplane, the washout rate I think was a little bit higher in the Stearmans, and the PTs was much more forgiving. Continuing on with the tailwheel side, this is fairly typical of World War II gear. Again, it's that spring oil strut assembly. The tire pressure is about 50 pounds. There's a little bit of weight to this tail. It swivels freely, but it does have a notch in it to help it go straight. So typically there is a little bit of steering capability with the rudder pedals by an arm on the right side. But there's a lot of weight to this tail. There's actually 495 pounds that Bill Tremblay and I once discovered when we weighed the airplane. So what does that really mean is that there's a lot more weight back there. You really do need to keep this airplane straight upon landing. because if it gets away from you, you have to dance on those rudder pedals fairly lightly, but fairly solidly in order to keep it straight. And this was a very good precursor for when you did get into the Harvard or T6, because it gave you a good basis for how things felt. So another piece of things that we often look at when we're doing our walk around is the rudder trims. And on the flight controls, obviously, we check everything out and wiggle it, and we look at our tabs, make sure everything looks okay, all the screws are tied in, etc. But in this case here, from the cockpit itself, um, the elevators itself are the only ones that have adjustable trim tabs within the cockpit, and that's that lower picture you see on the bottom right. You know, on the ailerons themselves, there's just a little tab of metal that only maintenance folks should be touching. In fact, I don't think we've really touched ours since we bought the airplane 7 years ago. But the elevator trim is very key, because what happens is as you're flying along, when you're taking off either solo or with somebody in back, you will constantly trim that airplane up and down. You'll do it on takeoff, you'll do it on landing. And the reason that you do that is that it's the pressure on the stick, so you don't have to muscle it with your forearms. Because if you have this out of trim, you may have an extra couple pounds that you're just fighting with your to hold that airplane on, and this relieves that pressure on the stick itself. So if you crank this clockwise, the trim will trim the nose down. If you do it counterclockwise, it goes back up. And typical settings for takeoff are 7 for nose up and 3 for nose down when you have people on back. And as Paul talked about in his earlier pictures on the flaps, we do have split flap type. And when you look at the upper right-hand picture there, you'll notice that the flap folds down outside of a wing. So in many of the other typical monoplanes these days, that, for example, even with my de Havilland Chipmunk, you'll take that whole flap and move the whole thing down. It doesn't separate like that. So it's mechanically operated. If you'll look on the lower right picture there, you'll see the flap lever with the yellow and black candy stripe on it. There's 3 positions on there: flaps fully up, half flaps, and flaps down. And for the pilots, we just hammer it into us not to extend the flaps below or above 95 miles an hour. Slips are not recommended with the flaps extended. And unlike many other typical flight trainers, we do not use flaps for takeoff.
That flap handle is awfully tricky to reach.
You have to be dedicated for it. Let's talk a little bit about the engine here for a moment. We do have a 200 horsepower Ranger, inverted 6-cylinder, and it's air cooled. And what the nice thing that you'll look at it often is that people say, gee, how do you see over that engine? And why is the engine mounted upside down? And very typically what happens is that if the engine was mounted right side up, you'd have another 18 inches or so above the plane of the nose of the prop here, and you couldn't see around it at all, and it'd be landing and flying it looking out the side, much like the Lindbergh airplane, for example. So they actually mount the engine upside down, and you can actually, the visibility over the nose of this airplane is actually very good for a tail dragger. You do need to probably do a little bit of an S-turn, but it kind of matters as to how tall you are. In my case, at 5'11", I can see just a little bit over the nose, so I'm doing fairly well.
Henning?
Yes.
Some of us aren't quite that tall.
I was being gentle there, Mike. Welcome.
I can still kind of see over the nose, but yeah, I still do S turns. It actually makes it better, but you know, it's probably 200 feet in front of me until I can see it clear.
Yeah.
But I always make sure the seat's all the way up too.
Is there a problem with the cylinders on this being inverted, like on the SNJ, where you got to, you know, spin the prop around and get oil that settles in? Is there any problems like that with this one?
That is very typical, and yes, it's a standard pre-flight procedure to crank that prop through a few times. Not only do you check for vapor lock, but also just to literally coat the engine with a little bit of oil in there prior to starting, get that moving around. Stan will talk a little bit about that as well. Couple other little details. Typically, you know, we run the engine, again, it's 200 horsepower, 2450 at sea level. The cruise RPMs are about just over 2,000. The red line is about 24. The airplane just handles beautifully. It's, you know, some people would say it's a little bit underpowered for its weight, but a little bit of that might have to do with the type of prop that we have on it. Whether you in some cases you'll have a climbing prop versus a cruising prop. We have a nice mixture between the two. It's a standard wooden Sensenich prop on there. It does pretty well for us. In fact, this is what it looks like. You'll notice that there's a hub on there with a number of screws that are safety wired. And in one case, I'm not sure if we quite see it, but Stan will point it out for us. There's a pre-flight item there to check for prop tightness. Very typical to the PT-26 and most World War II planes. You have two magnetos on the left and right side of the engine. One side of it, in this case, is the left magneto, which is why we started on the left mag, and it's tied in with an impulse coupler that we listen to the click as we turn it through. And it basically sets the timing for the spark going off to the different plugs for helping with the starting. Talk about gas. Another pre-flight point where we have about 24.5 gallons in each wing for a total of just about 49 gallons. Now, there's 22.5 usable per wing, and it gives us about 45 gallons that we can use in the airplane. Burns around 12 gallons an hour, which is what we typically use for our pre-flight planning. And you basically look at it by looking down in the wing outside of a cockpit. So, you know, things like the T6s and most airplanes ever since have moved those fuel gauges inside, but this is very, very typical for the World War II trainers. And one other you know, we do burn standard 100 low lead in the airplane. Some people criticize this, and owning a Chipmunk of British design, this is very typical, where that red ball in the back where it says rich is very typical for me. But for most American pilots, you realize that's opposite of what most other planes are. So we happen to point this out because it has a little bit of a Canadian influence of our airplane versus some of the other American pieces there. When we do our walk around and stuff, we typically check for water in the gas tank, and we sump bottom. We let out a little bit of fuel and check to see if there's any separation between water and gas. The only reason you'd get water in there is typically from condensation. In our standard case, we usually have the tanks full before we put it away. So it does have a left and right fuel selector, which is very typical, pictured in the bottom right. And again, a couple other things that it does talk about with the fuel pressure system. I mentioned already the amount of gas in the tanks, but there's a wobble pump on the left side. And what that does is that in order to start the airplane, uh, in your you pump this up in order to establish 3 pounds per square inch on the fuel pressure. And the reason that this is kind of unique is that in the upper right picture, you'll see a bit of a very typical World War II gauge where they do 3 different gauges in one, where you see the temperature of the engine in centigrade up in the upper portion, and then in the lower right, you'll see the fuel pressure. And what happens is there's a little red mark there, and that's the minimum fuel pressure of 2.5, and then the maximum of 5, and the typical green is the operating point there on that side. So it's very, very nice. So oil system. Yeah, typical to World War II planes, we do have just over 4 gallons of oil in this. Now, in the more post-World War II stuff, this is a lot of oil. Typically, like in a T-34, if there's any oil whatsoever, I'm talking with our friend Carl Schwerman, it's rather you look at this, and the T-34 is a very dry airplane, as we'll begin to know once our T-34 is coming out there. But of the World War II stuff, it tends to mark its territory, just like my Chipmunk, with a little bit of oil underneath the airplane. So very typical, we want to have at least 3 gallons of oil in the airplane at the completion of our flight. So our oil burn is about 1/4 an hour. So typically it's not unusual for us to add 1/4 or even 1.5 or something, depending on the length of our flight. We burn this typical Phillips W or 25 weight 60 type oil. And we did add in a Airwolf oil filter into it in 2015. Again, the oil pressure, again, is at the left side of this gauge on this triple that we talked about before. 70 PSI is max, 60 is desired. And again, I point out the colors on this little, the left-hand portion of that gauge, where you see the red at the minimum, yellow, and then green is very typical.
So just a quick note, Henning.
Yeah.
You have a great picture of that tri-gauge. That tri-gauge has a lot of history to it. And if you look in just about any warbird from the era, from a P-51, P-40 Corsair, number of airplanes all use that same layout, if not the exact same gauge. So it's a very authentic, very real, and a lot of history just right there in that particular instrument.
So this is something that took me a little bit of getting used to when I transitioned out of flying Citabrias and other tailwheels into World War II stuff. But the beauty of this particular gauge is that it looks like a peace sign when the engine's running. And you'll see the lower right gauge would point to the green, the lower left gauge points to the green. And then if that temperature gauge is anywhere near vertical, then you instinctively know that your engine's good. So it's very typical for us to do a quick glance at that every so often while in flight.
If you ever get the opportunity, Henning, I don't know if you have a picture somewhere, but on the opposite side of the panel is another jewel of an instrument, the original wind-up clock. It is really a beautiful piece of machinery. So if you ever get the chance, take a peek in the cockpit, and it's a very nice instrument.
Yeah. So I already talked a little bit about this gauge, and again, it's just a beautiful piece. So, but the oil temperature sense, again, minimum is typically 60 degrees centigrade, max is 93, and we typically run it at 1200 at 35 degrees up. We typically will taxi at that, we'll warm up the engine until we hit 35 degrees. By the time we actually complete our taxi and our run up and are ready to fly, our minimum temperature is 40 degrees centigrade on there. Basically, we do that to assure the oil is good and warmed up on the airplane and it's ready to fly. So let's talk a little bit briefly about the electrical system. It is a 12-volt system, and it has a typical battery, and there's an avionics master on the right side, and there's some strobe switches on the panel itself as well. The things that you'll see on the right side in the gray are fuses, very, very typical for us of the period. You'll see some switches here for navigation lights and things like that as well. Also, when the generator comes on about 1200 to 1300 RPM, before that, so you're warming it up, it's a little bit of coming off of the battery. Your voltmeter typically should read plus 13 volts or greater, and it indicates that the generator is charging the battery. Yeah, let's briefly talk about flight instruments before we pass it over to Stan here to show us the airplane. There's a vacuum system on the engine driven by a typical vacuum pump. It powers the artificial horizon, the directional gyro, and a turn and bank indicator in the front of the system, in the front cockpit. The typical vacuum pressure is typically about 3.5 to 4 inches of mercury in there, and you'll see it here in the right picture on the suction gauge. Now also in there's a pedostatic system for our flight, and the pedostatic, believe it or not, is that long thing sticking out of a right wing that you don't want to whack. You don't want to run into it. The actual static port is these little vertical rectangular holes right behind this ring, and that, believe it or not, this little circular piece here is adjustable by turning it back and forth. Now, we haven't had to adjust that, but it's a typical kind of thing that if something were to ice up or to have issues, it can affect things like our altimeter or our airspeed that we use for when we're landing the airplane. So, so the three typical instruments that are driven by this system are our airspeed indicator, our altimeter, and something that we call the vertical speed indicator, which tells us how fast we're climbing or descending. And of course, you'll see that red cover on there when it's not in use. Couple quick things on the operations. When we get into our whole thing as CAF pilots, it's not just like we jump into the airplane and go off we run. There's a whole slew of things that we adhere to and we take very seriously. And I only include this slide because for those that do want to be CAF pilots, if you're not already or working towards that, there's not only the standard FAA stuff that you'll see, but there's some check rides that we do on an annual basis. If you get a ride from a CAF pilot, he is blessed with all of these different things. We track this stuff in the CAF Fortress side, everything from our pilot's license, our medical, our recurrencies, CAF annual check rides, hold harmless. We all do ground schools. We all do cockpit management, safety training. There's a whole slew of things that we do very typically. So the other thing that kicks in is that if we do have somebody in the back seat, we do a little bit of a weight and balance to check that we are in line. And the basic weight of this airplane is 2,153 pounds. And once that's without fuel and passengers. So when I say passenger, that includes a pilot. So the maximum gross with oil, all full gas and pilots is 2,800 pounds. So 45 gallons, about 6 pounds per gallon for gas. So, and we do have a tiny little compartment for baggage in the back behind the second seat for about 50 pounds in there. But this is something very typical that we do a calculation before every flight to make sure we're within specs on the airplane. And in this case, we also have a little Excel sheet that helps us with, courtesy of Scott Dennison. All right, Stan, I think we're ready for your side here. You ready to go?
We are. Can you hear me?
Yes, we have.
Okay.
We're live. We see you.
All right. Sure, I'll hold it. Okay, hope you can see me. This is going to be a little awkward. If you get vertigo when I'm moving along, just close your eyes and it'll be over shortly. That's what I tell my passengers too. So, as with most things we do with an airplane, paperwork comes first. So we need to first of all sign out the plane with the and have it approved by the operations officer, which every pilot does. We have to get the hold harmless forms and other paperwork signed. We have what's called the green book, which is over there. Every CAF aircraft has this green book, which includes where it's where we log every flight. We log the oil quantity, we log the fuel quantity, and typically those are the things that we look at first before we even get anywhere near the aircraft. Once we do get near the aircraft and we begin our pre-flight, I have a checklist here, but I use it as a checklist, not a do list. So I'm going to put it on the side for now and check it at the end of the pre-flight. I will have already checked the tires to make sure the tires are properly inflated, and I will have checked the fuel. I'm not going to get into that today, but I will check the fuel quantities, log that, see if I need to buy more fuel or not. So now starting with the actual pre-flight, what I'll do is go into the cockpit. Hopefully this works.
You're looking good, Stan.
What do you say?
You're doing good.
Okay. So typically I'm going to look at the overall condition of the cockpit, make sure things are where they needed to be. The checklist is over in the pocket. As most pilots know, the first thing you do is there's an acronym called ARROW. Those are things that are required documents that you have to have in the aircraft. And that would be the A would be for the airworthiness certificate. And the R would be the registration certificate, both of which are behind the pilot right there. The O would be the pilot operating handbook, which is in the rear pocket of the airplane right now, and the weight and balance calculation, which is in the POH as well. So we have all that. I'll then look at the circuit breakers or fuses to make sure that they're all in. I make sure that all the switches are off, and I'll make sure that the magnetos are off, and I'll make sure that the mixture switch is all the way in idle cutoff, which is all the way forward, as Henning spoke about earlier. I'll make sure that the fuel is on the most full tank, which is what is required for takeoff. Once I get in the plane, I'll look to see what the trim tab setting would be, and I will have pulled flaps to full flaps by manipulating this. Now this is locked because of our we're in the middle of the annual right now, so I'm not going to manipulate it. I'm going to leave it where it's at. So we have two cockpits, and so because making sure that the magneto is off is so critical, we also check to make sure that it's off in the rear cockpit as well, and the mixture is in full forward. So we're good to go on the pre-flight. So the first thing that I do is check to make sure, I'll give a little tug on the flaps. Usually I have them all the way down for full flaps, and I'm not going to manipulate them, but I just want to make sure that there's a little bit of play, but then they're not loose or anything like that. Because we're in the middle of the annual, we get a real treat to be able to look inside. Typically there's a band here to cover up this access hole, but now you could see the wooden nature of the big part of the wing here. This is laminated plywood along with steel ribs and things like that. So when I'm at this point, I just kind of look at the wing, to make sure it looks smooth. There aren't, you're going to have some little wrinkles in there just by the nature of the construction, but there's nothing unusual in that regard. Then I'll come over to the aileron, and I'll check every connection to make sure that we have a cotter pin where it should be. And I just look in all of these axis holes right here, and then I'll just manipulate the aileron to make sure that it's moves smoothly. There's no binding in the cables or anything like that. And then what I'll do is I'll walk around, make sure that the position lights and strobe lights are tight. They're not loose. There's no play in that. And then I'll just kind of stand here and look at the plane and make sure that the aircraft is sitting well. And I can tell that it's right now it's a little bit unbalanced, but typically you want the same amount of space in each strut, which I'll get at. But right now, as you can tell, it's torn apart. But when all the panels are put on, you get a good sense of how the plane is sitting. I'll come up here to the strut. There's really no maintenance or anything to be done on a pre-flight on the strut, but I will make sure that I have about 3 fingers of space in the strut, and I do, so that's good. That means that we have plenty of hydraulic fluid inside that strut. I'll make sure that there's no leaking brake fluid. And then I won't do it today, but I'll climb underneath the aircraft and sump each of the 2 fuel tanks. So the access hole is farther down there for the fuel tank, and I'm not going to go there. But the purpose of that is to make sure that there's no water in the fuel, whether it came from the company that we bought the fuel, which is very rare, or as Henning mentioned, if there's any condensation. We're lucky that we can have this access hole open during the annual, and just to show a few things, there we have a place for a fire extinguisher down there, which we check all the time, and the seats raise and lower, as you can tell, but for people of different heights, I always have the rudder pedals full forward, but they're adjustable. So if somebody like, say, Mike Woods wished to fly, there's a little arm here on the inside that you can actually maneuver that with your foot as you're sitting in the cockpit, but they can be adjusted. That's full forward, and that's full, or I should say that's full back, and that's full forward. So it really makes a difference when you're flying the aircraft. Now we'll go to the engine. Henning kind of explained that, and I'm not going to go through all that. We unfortunately don't have a prop to manipulate. There's some slight delamination on the propeller, and so it's kind of dark there. And so we had to go get that overhauled. So it's in the overhaul shop right now. But
I'll be back soon.
Right. Now, if we did have a propeller, as Henning said, we will typically pull the propeller through with about 8 blades. And the purpose for that, as Henning mentioned, was to make sure that there's no hydraulic lock that really draws the oil that might be sitting in the inverted cylinders, draws it up into the engine, because you could actually damage the engine and damage the cylinder by starting it with oil locked down inside the cylinders. We also will as we're turning the propeller, we want to make sure that we can hear a click, and that's the impulse coupler on the left magneto, and that tells that that's what aids in starting the aircraft. So we want to make sure we can hear that click, because that's really that's how the aircraft is started. So I'll come on this side of the engine. Again, of course, we always have the access panel here, but there's a door that opens up, and this is the oil tank that holds 4.1 gallons of oil. The dipstick is attached to the oil cap, so that's really convenient, and it has markings for every gallon, 2 gallons, 3 gallons, 4 gallons. So we check that as part of our pre-flight and log the amount of oil that is in there. And oil is poured into that location as well. Some tanks have, in some other aircraft, you have a different dipstick for the oil, but you put the oil in somewhere else. In this case, it's the same location. So again, looking at the strut, we have about 3 fingers worth of space on the strut, so that looks good. And then I'll look at the length of the wing just to make sure the wing looks good and is smooth. It's a beautiful wing here. And then I'll remove the cover for the pitot-static. So here's the pitot tube, and the static ports are right here, as Henning said. Normally this is movable, but at some point it was painted on. But wherever it was painted on, and we could move it if we needed to, but it gives us very accurate readings, so we're real happy with the feedback on that. Then I'll come back to this side of the wing, make sure the lights are solid, nothing is loose there. And I'll do the same thing with respect to looking at the right aileron, make sure it's smooth, that there's no binding at all with the cables. I'll check all the connections just to make sure that, sorry about that, just to make sure that we have, they're all fastened, nothing is loose in there. I'm not going to walk there because we have a lot of items here, and I don't want to step on any of our parts of the airplane that are laying around here right now. Then we'll come up to the tail, critical component, obviously. And I'll first just touch it a little bit and just give a little wiggle, just to make sure that there's nothing loose, nothing happened, there's been no damage from a previous flight. I'll look to make sure, just look at the underside, make sure it looks clean, there's no damage to the underside of the wing. And then I will come back here to the elevator. Again, look at all of the connections to make sure that they either safety wired or have a cotter pin, and they do. And then what I'll do is I'll manipulate the elevator, make sure again there's no binding at all in the cables, and then I'll come back over here. I'm gonna hold this back a little bit. This is really important to make sure these cables go to the trim tab, which is right here, and the arm is there. Interestingly, the arm is on the other side for the left elevator, and the reason for that was so that the manufacturer didn't have to make 2 different elevators. They could just invert one on each side. This is a really critical component. This arm here crosses through the rudder and has 2 of these arms. This arm steers the tail wheel, and as we look on the other side, this bar passes through, and this drives the rudder. A year ago, about a year and a half ago, Mike Woods and I were doing a training flight, and after landing on 1-8, I felt a lot of play in the tail wheel steering. It just wasn't locking up, and so we aborted the rest of the flight. We taxied back to get fuel, and I noticed that this had cracked, and so it's been welded and fixed, and it cracked and actually put a slight hole in the rudder right there, which we have fixed, but that rendered tail wheel steering inoperable. So we were careful as we brought the plane back to the hangar, and it was down for a little while that was getting fixed. Now I'll go to the rudder. I'm not going to manipulate the rudder that much. I'm just going to make sure that it feels solid. Once again, I'll check all of the connections and make sure that we have cotter pins there. Again, I'll give this bar a nice tug. And here's what I mentioned about the trim tab. Here's the arm that controls the trim tab. It's on the other side of the one on the left side, or the right side. On the left side here, it's on top. And these cables right here, just want to make sure they're taut and there's no play in them. Again, I'll check to make sure all the connections are there. I'll move the elevator just to make sure that there's no play, no binding or anything like that. And then I will go to my checklist and just make sure that I've done everything that I needed to do, and I did. And then I think we're ready to brief a passenger on the flight and go flying. Give that to you, Bob. Do we have any questions in the chat, or anybody have any questions they want to talk about?
I haven't seen any chat so far, so.
Let me maybe just leave it up there. Let me show you. Since this panel is off, let's you can see the turtle deck. There's a small luggage. Maybe you should. Okay, thanks. So there's the inside of the turtle deck where we have just some slight storage area. But here is a unique opportunity to see the wooden ribbing and the aluminum ribs of the inside of the covering of the
back end of the
aircraft.
fuselage there. Very nice.
Yeah. So it's extremely clean. It looks really good, and we're anxious for this to be back online, hopefully in a few weeks.
One nice thing is the reason that we have that uncovered is for our annual inspection here. And when you look at the combination of the tubes with wooden stringers and stuff, obviously the metal portion of that is very structured to take the weight and pieces of the airplane itself. But wood is happening more to the less sensitive, just to give it good form and good airflow. But that's very, very typical of the time. And when you look inside this airplane, it's actually been, you can tell it's been very well cared for and taken care of. And there's a lot of cases in this, for these types of planes, once they hit their 70 to 75 years old, you open that up and it looks like a complete basket case inside with mouse nests or whatever, you know, kind of critters come when they found this thing in a barn or something. So, but we have a very nice, clean airplane here. So,
Stan or Bob, I think if you go around to the front of the airplane, you may be able to get a good view of the center spar. And that was the first time I had actually put eyes on it. It's the main wooden cross member that connects the two wings together and connects to the fuselage right there between the main gear. What's surprising about it is the sheer size of the wooden spar that runs between. It's painted in the middle. It's painted a gray in the middle to just protect it from oils and other contaminants. You can see the edge of it there. Mm-hmm. But up in those cubby holes, you can also see it in its natural wood color. It's you see a long tube there running up the middle. And then it's where that tube goes through. It's the large flat part, I suppose. That tube is going right through a large, thick wooden block, basically.
The lower right part of your screen there, the spar itself goes right down the top of a wing. It's not the leading edge of
right.
A wing. It's actually pretty much at the thickest part of the widest part of a wing. So it's typically about a foot back to maybe sometimes even more, 18 inches, depending on the form of the wing itself. But it runs from wingtip to wingtip through the entire piece.
Yep. In this view, it looks like just a thin piece of sheet metal, perhaps, or just a wall, but it's actually a very thick wooden block, like you might see a beam in a house or something.
Yep. Yeah, it'll remind you very much like the structured beams that are laminated together these days.
Right.
Not really. Yeah.
Good job.
Great, Paul. I appreciate that. Yeah, that's not an item that pilots normally see because it's all behind access panels, but I appreciate you pointing that out.
Yeah, I was excited to see the spar, and I was also excited to see that it is in, I think in that access panel there, Bob, to the next to the gear, you can see the wooden, it's uncoated. I don't know, it'd probably be hard to see it. But anyway, I was excited to see it as a pilot and see how good of condition it's in.
Right.
And you had a nice view of the fuel tank there a moment ago.
In our engine right now.
Sure.
This is Mike
Yeah.
Woods. My understanding is the center section has been rebuilt.
That's correct.
Yeah, at least once. So I think it is in really good shape. So
Right here, we're looking at the cylinders with the spark plugs on the air at the main front of the air intake. So very typical of air-cooled engines. You'll see where the air will come in and run across each cylinder, and typically there will be spark plug wires attached to each plug there as it goes down. It gives you a nice perspective as to the air fins, where the air actually cools down through it as it goes through the area there.
Yeah, I don't think so.
We're sitting at a good time. We're basically at 11:35. We're not hurting for time. I don't know if there's other things you want to cover, Stan.
I'm good. I don't want to keep everybody's time, but if are there any other questions?
I'm not seeing anything on.
I just had one question out of curiosity. Stan, you mentioned that when you're flying, you put it on the fullest tank. Is there if both tanks are full, is there a preference on which tank you use? On some airplanes, there are because of the fuel pumps and stuff.
Well, so takeoff is always on the most full tank, which obviously makes sense. That's when you're changing. You're getting sloshing of the fuel and things like that. You certainly don't want to be possibly being fuel starved on takeoff. And then typically we will fly. You can change it maybe every 15 minutes. I'm hesitant to change it that frequently because it's not necessary. The plane does not get out of balance that significantly. Typically, I might keep it on the same tank all the way to my destination, even if it's Oshkosh, because the fuel valve actually has a cork piece inside that turns, and there's always, and this has happened before, where you start to turn it and it won't turn all the way, and all of a sudden you've starved your engine of fuel. So good practices are to make that change near an airport. So if that ever happens to you, you have the ability to land at an airport. So certainly, yeah, if you have a long distance flight, you're going to have to make that change so that the aircraft does not get too unbalanced. And as long as you do it in a safe way and at altitude, I think you're fine. But it flies very well being somewhat out of balance.
I don't know. Sorry, Stan, Steve. I don't know of any requirement or recommendation in the POH indicating that you should start or take off on one tank or the other, just as Stan mentioned, on the fullest tank. So I think generally what I try to do is just leave it alone until I have to change tanks. Whoever left it on whatever tank is what I leave it on.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. The only reason I asked, I know some aircraft, they say, yeah, always the fullest tank. Yeah, but sometimes if both tanks are full, your fuel pumps from one side versus the other more, whatever. So I was just curious. So that's fine.
Yeah. Interesting comment I'd like to add on the fuel valve that Stan was talking about, that cork valve. There's a similar valve in the SNJ. And Steve Sorge and I did some testing on our SNJ this spring and found that our valve was cross-feeding, indicating that the cork may have been deteriorated and allowing it to feed. We'd burn on one side for the whole flight and come back, and the right side was down when we were burning on the left. So it was cross-feeding. And if you burned the left tank way low and left the right tank full, if you let it set for a few days, you'd come back and they were equalized on both sides. So there was cross-feeding going on. So one of the things we just did at Sam Tabor's shop this past week is we pulled that gas valve apart. And to the surprise of Sam Tabor, he found that we had somewhat of a homemade or unauthorized Teflon plug in there, instead of a cork one, which is he heard stories about people had made these things in the years past and used them illegally to replace the cork, but he had never seen one before. But he wouldn't put it back in because it's not legal. So I had a spare cork valve that I have had with me since I was flying my buddy's airplane. And so we installed that one, and our fuel valve is now restored to like new again. But yeah, that's you don't want to be changing that thing back and forth all the time, like the manual says. That was great back in the war years when everything was like brand new. But these valves do wear and can deteriorate. And the other thing that Sam Tabor pointed out is the lubricant that they make today is not the same quality that they had back in the war years. The super lube that they used on these fuel valves is no longer made. They have to use a substitute, and it is not as good. And so everybody agrees that do the minimum amount of changing. And as Vic Stottlemyre always says, make sure you're changing when you're on top of an airport, in case something doesn't go right and you got to sit down. So interesting point. I thought I'd pass that along.
Good. Thank you, Gary. Appreciate that.
Good.
Anything else?
Any other questions? Going once, going twice.
Do we have any update on the propeller? Is it back yet? Did somebody say it wasn't back yet, or is it still due yet?
It was when I talked to Clint a week ago or so, he thought it would be on its way back sometime around this week or the end of this past week. So I haven't gotten an update there, but I would think that it should be, if you throw in 5 or 6 days for shipping, it's coming back from the east coast of Florida, down by Boca Raton area. So I would hope to have that back, sometime next week, maybe. So
good. Maybe it's a race. Can you hear me now? It looks like Henning's lit up. You still on?
Yep, we hear you, Gary.
Oh, okay. Yeah, maybe it's a race between that and the mag. Or I'm going to pick up 2 mags from Chris Ott this afternoon at 4 o'clock at his Appleton Airport. We're borrowing his 2 mags to see if they might solve our mag problem. And I know Wally, you pulled off 2, and they were sent down there for testing too. So we're going to have a 1 out of 4 chance of finding a mag coil that works.
There we go.
So that's looking on the bright side too. So those are the 2 things that I see standing in the way of the plane getting back in the air, that mag and getting the prop back from the prop shop. So we're very close, very exciting.
Clint thought we would be back together pretty quickly as soon as that prop comes in. And so he's, the sheet metal and stuff goes together fairly quickly. So, hey, thank you so much, Gary, on that. Hey, do you have any words on T-34 for T-34 guys?
Steve, you want to update on the not so good news from GAMI, but it's the news we have. So,
yeah, I don't know what to say about the GAMI thing. Right, they're still working on the Dallas T-34, which is putting us behind. Our control surfaces that we need to take down, they're all set to go. Gary's just working it into his schedule to get them down there. I would say right now, the best we're going to be looking for, and I'm glad I'm not in a room where anybody can punch me or something like that, but I would say it's probably going to be, I would be happy if we have it by the 4th of July.
Yeah, it's they gave us a little surprise. They were telling us all along that just get those parts down there end of April. They'll throw them on, and they should be done first week of May. We should be able to start checkouts and everything. And we are getting that story pretty steady from Tim Rull, the owner there. But the guy working on the plane in the shop that actually does the mods sent me an email asking me if we had some part that he needed for the Dallas plane, because we helped him out before with some parts. So I said, oh, gee, I'd like to talk to this guy. So I sent him a note back on the part. And by the way, how's our plane coming along? And he tells me, oh, we just started on that thing and we got, like 6 weeks to go. Oh, so thanks. So not quite the news. So then we had a little a phone conversation back with Tim Rail and Nut Group, and found out that, yeah, they're just not quite as far along, but they are in the final. It is in the shop. It's being worked on. And and we will get those beautiful painted, balanced, and ready to go control surfaces down there. I picked those all up last Saturday from Myers Aviation, and they look beautiful. The paint just looks just as sharp as what what the plane itself looks like.
And all the dents are out of it too, right?
And so they rolled it. You can't tell the new flap from the used flap. They both look beautiful. And we had one brand new aileron and a used aileron, and both of them looked the same. And then, of course, the two elevators were brand new. And then we have the two wingtips that Carl donated, and those are brand new to start with, but they're painted that beautiful deep blue, and they're ready to go. So we got all those parts. They're stashed at the T6 hangar right now, waiting to be loaded into a transport vehicle and taken down there. So. Probably get down there in the next few weeks with them. There isn't any huge rush to get them down there, but I don't want them to be a holdup to any of their work down there. But right now they're concentrating on getting the mods done on the spar and the tail. And while they're doing all that, they're doing the annual inspections of those areas too. So they're kind of doing two things at the same time. So anyway, it's pretty exciting. We're down to the very short weeks left to go. And we're pretty excited about it, although a little disappointed with the timing. But I'd hate to be that Dallas group that's been waiting a whole lot longer than we have been to get their plane back too. So everybody's in a holding mode, waiting for GAMI guys to get done. That's the update.
All right.
And thanks, Bob and Stan. Great job, live streaming from the hangar. I thought that worked out really well. You guys are like a news crew. Good job.
Thanks, Paul. All right. Everybody, thank you very much for attending. I don't know what our next meeting will hold, but I think if we get good feedback on this, I think we'll do something interesting as well. Thank you. Have a great Saturday.
Great, thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye now.
All right, guys. Nice job.
Nice job, guys.
Yep.
Thank you
all.